Hey, what's up everybody? Today I'm going to show you how to make this bubbling surface effect. We're going to use soft body dynamics and we're going to create the effect in Cinema 4D, and then we will do a quick Octane run through of how you could quickly light it and texture it in Octane for a great final product. Let's get started. Okay, so before we get started, I wanted to show the reference that this sort of inspiration came from. And this is actually from MSH Prod, who's the host of the Motion Designers Community Instagram. And you can see, I'll put the link to this reference in the description, but there's a lot of people that worked on this piece. I'm not exactly sure who. I think it was actually Maxime who worked on the bubble reference that we're looking at right now. So if you just watch this is sort of what we're going to be looking at. And it's just super quick, but it's really nice. You can see like the bubbles are sort of inflating and pushing each other out of the way, and then as they're inflating, there's also these sort of ripples that are happening a little bit, and we'll kind of be looking at how to just create that right there. So definitely check out this video. Like I said, I'll put the link in the description, but I just wanted to reference that before we get started. Okay, so here we are in a blank project of Cinema 4D, and first thing we're going to do is create the surface that the bubbles will be distributed on. So to do that, we're just going to use a plane, and let's set the segments to 1 and 1. And we want the bubbles to be sort of distributed and scaled in a random way, so we don't just want to create a sort of like grid and then display them on that. So the best way I found to do this is to throw that plane into a Voronoi fracture. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to have a sphere and clone it onto the polygon center of each of these points. So if we go into the Voronoi fracture, we can go to the point distribution and sort of adjust these settings a little bit. I think I want a few more points, so let's do something like 35, and then maybe we just adjust the seed until we get something a little more even, like that. All right, so we're going to now create our bubble, so that's going to be a sphere, and this sphere we're going to make it an icosahedron because it's just got nice evenly distributed points and polygons, and then we'll make the radius about 20. Okay, so now we're going to throw that sphere, holding down Alt or Option with the sphere selected, into a cloner, and then we're going to change the mode to Object, and what we want to do is throw the Voronoi fracture into the object. And we have a ton of spheres, way too many. So instead of the distribution being surface, we're going to distribute it on polygon center. Okay, so now you can see we've got a bunch of spheres sort of distributed one per polygon on this Voronoi fracture. But the space in between them isn't great because it's sort of every sphere is the same size. So what we want to do is enable scaling, and you see nothing happens. So this is something I just figured out when I was doing a test for this, is the scale doesn't work with the Voronoi fracture because of some way that the Voronoi fracture is being calculated. So you actually have to throw that into a connect object first. So we'll do that, and then we'll turn off weld, and let's just call this bubble source. And in the cloner, instead of the Voronoi, we'll throw in the bubble source. Now you see we've got scaling, and the scaling is based on the surface area of the polygon that we're talking, the spheres being cloned onto. So as you can see, the spheres are larger in the larger polygons and smaller in the smaller polygons. So we want to, let's go into the top view, just middle mouse and then click over here to the top view. And you see some of these are intersecting, and we don't want that. So we could actually just click the sphere and hit T for scale and just maybe scale it down. Make sure there's no intersections happening. Those look a little too close. Yeah, I think that should work pretty well. And you can kind of play with this, adjust the scale of the sphere and the influence of the polygon scale, and just kind of get it somewhere like this where the big bubbles or the big gaps are sort of filled with these bigger bubbles, and the small gaps have these smaller spheres. Let's go ahead and stay organized and name this bubbles. All right. So the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and create an effector, and it's going to be a plane effector. And if we go to the parameters, zero out the position. We'll come back to that. Let's do, just for now, let's do the scale. So we want to affect uniform scale, so we'll click uniform scale and do something like 0.75, maybe 0.85. Maybe we'll do 1 or 1.15. Okay. So this is going to be how we grow and inflate the spheres, and then we're going to have soft body dynamics on the bubbles on the cloner. You could do this through the soft body tag, but I found just through the testing that I did for this, I feel like this works a little bit better, and it just calculates a little bit faster. So this is how I want to do it here. In the fall off of the plane effector, let's go ahead and call this inflation. In the fall off, let's go ahead and create a step effector. So first thing we're going to do is go into the contour mode, change that to curve, right click on the curve, and let's just make it linear. That's nice and easy. So if we pull this first point back, you see what we've got. It's sort of inflating one by one until they're all partially inflated, and then if you pull this one over, it's the inverse where they sort of all become inflated. So what we want to do is basically animate this from being a spline like this to that. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll start off with both points all the way at 1, at a value of 1. And we'll click a keyframe, move forward to like 10 frames, and drag this bottom point out just a little bit, somewhere like that, 0.9. And then let's hit another keyframe, and then let's move over to like frame 40. Just hold shift to grab both these points and move them all the way over here to where that point is touching the 0, and this point is over here. Hit a keyframe, move forward about 10 frames, and drag this point over. Set another keyframe. So now if you look at it, this is kind of what we've got. Cool. And if you notice, there's this one little clone over here that just doesn't want to scale, and what I found was you just have to offset the spline by 1%, because I think the index of that clone is 0.0. Yeah, you can hardly see it, but it's 0. So if you don't have that spline offset to 1%, then it'll just not scale that one. But if you see now, it's got that one is the final one that gets scaled. So that works. Okay, so this is still very like rigid. So in the same inflation plane effector, let's add a delay to smooth this out. So this is basically going to take whatever fall off is happening here and just smooth it out. So let's do like a value of like 25 and see how that looks. Yeah, so you see how they're just a lot more, it's just a lot more smooth motion, kind of not as jerky as it was before. It's either very like sudden, which might work, but for our case, just so that there's no issues with the simulation, I'm just gonna smooth that out. Okay, so now these are scaling, and you can see as they scale, they're intersecting, and it just, you know, that's not exactly the look we're going for. You want them to sort of press up against each other and inflate. So we're gonna add a, excuse me, a soft body tag onto the bubble cloner. We want this, it's on the cloner, so we want it to apply to children in the collision, and we want it to be the top level. So it'll take the sphere that's in the top level of the cloner and apply the soft body dynamics to that. We can leave the rest of this default for now, and then if you go into the soft body tab or the soft body tab, you could probably lower the flexion to something like 25, just so that they not like morph around each other in a really nice way. Before we go any further, I want to just go to hit Controller Command D, and it'll take you to the project settings. If you go to the Dynamics and the General tab, set the gravity to 0. I usually do this when I'm doing any sort of simulation, because you can just create your own gravity with a force and use that. It seems a little more, it runs a little faster, and it's just a little more like customizable. So we'll set that to 0. We don't need gravity in this case. And then if you go to the Expert tab, I found just from my previous tests that we need about 10 steps per frame just to give us a little more accurate simulation. And then this actually was already set, but if you set that to default, we're going to want, instead of 1, maybe like 0.5. That just seemed to work better for me. Okay, so let's take a look and see how this looks. And it's going to be calculating really slow, but as you can see, they're sort of inflating and then pushing into one another and just kind of filling up the space, and it looks really nice. And one thing you'll see is as they inflate, some of them are getting pushed away. So we don't really want that. We kind of want them to stay in the current position that they have and that they're holding. So that's an easy fix. We can just go to the simulation tag and go to force and just turn on to follow position and follow rotation. We're just going to set these to the maximum of just 100, which will basically keep that each sphere very close or in the same position that it starts at, so they won't be pushing each other around as we sort of simulate it. So let's watch this again. They're being pushed together. If we go to more of a top view here, we can see how this looks. And like I said, it's calculating really slow, but we'll cache all this out in the end. All right. Cool, so that looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and I think I actually want to lower the flexion just a little bit, maybe like 10 even, just because I want them to really morph around each other. Let's take a look at that. I'll speed it up here. Okay, so yeah, that looks pretty good. I think I want them to be inflating a little more randomly. So what I'm going to do is just go back to the beginning and just mess with the scale of the bubbles. So maybe we bring this, back up to 20, and then we can turn the, or actually let's maybe bring the scale down and the influence of the scaling up. And just make sure we don't have any intersections. I think we're good there. All right, let's play this one more time. All right, I think I'm pretty happy with that. You could keep tweaking this with dynamics. That's the thing. You can kind of just tweak it until the end of days, but I think I'm good with that for now. All right, so let's go back to the beginning. So we've got these inflating. But we want them to, like the reference, they sort of come out of the ground. It's almost like the ground, the pieces of the ground inflate. So what they had was almost like these segments of the ground would basically bubble up and turn into these like big sphere-like bubbles. So what we're gonna do is create a cube that is gonna be our ground. And if you middle mouse and go over to the right side here, we want to bring this down to like 80. So you see the biggest bubble, let's turn on the wireframe mode. The biggest bubble we've got, this one right here, is just barely above the top of that. So we want to sort of fill the, or cover all of the spheres with this cube, and that's going to act as our ground, and then I'll sort of explain how we're going to have them pop out of the ground later down the road. So we've got the height set. Now if we want to just kind of make sure this is good on the width. I think about 500 and 500 should work. I think there's no intersecting. Let's go to the top view and hit lines just to be sure. All right. So now we've got the same thing, but we want these bubbles as they inflate. I'm going to turn the X-ray on the cube so we can kind of see through it. And let's turn off this bubble source. So we want them, as they're inflating, we actually want them to sort of move their center point from the 0 point up 40 centimeters to the top of that bubble, or the top of that cube rather, so that sort of acts as like the ground, and then the bubbles are inflating from there. So that's pretty easy. We can just go to the inflation plane effector that we set up earlier, and in the position we can just set the bubbles, because we've got this fall off that's already affecting the scale, and we can use that same fall off to affect the position. So you would think position on Y would be the one to use, but it's actually Z because of the way that they're aligned on the surface. So if we do half of our height on the cube, which would be 40, the cube's 80 centimeters, so on the Z we want it to be 40 centimeters up. So as those bubbles are sort of getting infected by the step effector, they will inflate the scale, and they will also move up 40 centimeters. So let's go ahead and turn off the X-ray and see if this worked properly. Cool, so you see as they're inflating, they're sort of almost looks like they're coming out of the top of this sphere, or this cube rather, and then they're pressing, like smushing into each other and kind of creating that that look that we want. So this looks pretty good, but I think I actually want a little bit more variation in the amount that these are growing. So in order to do that, I think what we'll do is just, for now, we'll hide the cube and go back to frame 0, and then let's make these bubbles 20 centimeters, and then let's just change the scale influence up a little bit, so like maybe 55. Actually, let's scale these down. Just want them to be a little bit more dramatic in terms of the size difference between them, so that they can inflate in the different amounts, so that it just gives it more variation on that surface. Looks like we've got a little bit of intersection there, so we just want to turn that down and just tweak this. Like, I've gone back and forth on it a bunch. I just want it to look varied on the surface, like kind of like the reference, but I think that should probably be a little better. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that. Actually, now that we did that, you can see our sphere is sort of poking through there at the top. So let's make sure that our cube is just a little bit bigger. Let's do 86. And then if you remember, we changed the position to be half of the height of the cube. So let's just make that 43, half of 86. And let's check that out. I'm going to turn off the sphere, or the cube for now. Yeah, and it looks like maybe some of these are just inflating a little too much. So if we want to just adjust this, we can go in the plane effector and just change the scale to maybe like 0.85 so that it doesn't inflate quite as much. Let's try that. All right, yeah, that's looking a little better. So now if we turn back on our cube, what we can see is basically from the side view, we've got these spheres that have moved up and inflated, and so they're acting as if the cube's top plane or polygon is the ground plane. Okay, so now how are we going to connect these? I've tried different ways. I tried doing like a volume builder and creating like a volume, but these are so close together that a lot of them sort of just started to blend together and create like metaball shapes, where we want these to feel like individual parts of a plane that are that are inflating. So what we can do next is a method that I used for the previous version, and let's move this down. And so first thing is we'll throw both the cube and the bubbles into a connect object and uncheck weld. Oh, they should be in a single connect object. All right, and then next I want to cache out the simulation just so that we have a nice clean simulation that we can use. So I'm going to speed this part up and then we'll move on. Okay, so here we are in the future. That took about 5 minutes, three minutes maybe. You kind of lose track of time when you're caching simulations. It's all a blur. No, okay, so once you cache that out, this is kind of, if we play it back, we've got a really speedy playback, and we can kind of take a look at it. So it's looking pretty good. You could adjust, like I said, you could adjust the scale and the inflation of these as you want, but I think this is actually pretty good for what we're trying to do. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step. All right, so the next step, let's just call this bubbles connected. Oops. And we're going to have a plane, and we're going to add another plane in the scene. And let me just tell you, what we're basically going to do is we're going to shrink wrap this plane onto the connect object. So from the top view, you want the plane to be about as big, not quite as big as the cube, but just definitely encapsulate all the bubbles. So let's just do something like that. And then we want to give it a bunch of segments, so like 150 by 150. So you got a lot of segments here. Okay, so we want to move the plane into position, sort of like we did, if we look at that. We want it to be above the tallest sphere bubble so that it's projecting downward. So it's basically going to look at whatever's below it and project, basically force the polygons down onto that object, those objects. So let's just go ahead and add a shrink wrap, hold shift, and it'll be a child of the plane. And then we're going to grab the bubbles connected object and move that there. Okay, so now if we hide the connected bubbles, there's a little bit of a refresh error, but there we go. You can see what we've got. And this is, obviously there's some issues of at the edge breaks where it's kind of not quite as smooth, but we can kind of fix that later. So you can see, and there may be some refresh errors, but if you look at it, the bubbles will pop out of the plane and sort of form these bubbles just out of the surface. So this is actually really cool. So now we can use, we can adjust the Phong tag, maybe 180, and that will smooth out some of those. But we can also sort of, what I'm going to do just for the sake of speed is I'm going to bake this down to a point level animation, and then we'll add a smoothing and subdivisions and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the plane. That's that refresh error. And we're just going to hit the C key, and that's going to be, let's call this surface shrink wrap. And so that's editable now, so we can bake the point level animation. So you don't have to do this. You could also just apply other deformers underneath here and a subdivision surface and all that stuff. But for the sake of the tutorial, I want everything to move quickly. So I'm going to basically bake this down to point level animation, turn off all the simulation stuff so that doesn't have to calculate, and then we can do a quick lighting and texturing of all of this. So it's jumping around like crazy, but that won't be an issue once we bake it down. So, all right, let's go ahead and go to Window and Dope Sheet. And this is our timeline. And we're just going to, I'm sure there's other ways to do this, but I just like to drag the shrink wrap into the timeline and then go to Functions, Bake Objects. And we want to, yes, do the full range, create a copy, do clean tracks, leave all that default. And then by default, it should look like this. We're just going to hit PLA, and I'm just going to do all parameters. I just wanted to make sure that it gets everything. So we'll do that, and I will be back in a second. All right, so that actually went pretty quick because we had already baked the animation or the dynamics. So first of all, we've got our copy here. So let's just retitle this wrap underscore baked, and then we can delete the shrink wrap from underneath that one. All right, and I'm going to move that to the top because I'm going to take the original shrink wrap plane that's not baked, turn off the shrink wrap. We'll hide that. And then I'm going to go into the connect, and I'm going to turn off all of this so that we don't have any of that calculating in the background. And then I'm just going to basically, I'll just group everything, call this sim, and just move all this stuff into the sim folder. And we'll just hide that. All right, so now if we look at this, we've just got a clean baked surface, and this is what it looks like. Cool. So that looks pretty good. Now we can address sort of these issues with the weird polygon stuff going on. Maybe we actually do want to bring this down to what it was, default 40. And then, okay, so let's first add a smoothing, and that already smooths it out a ton. So we can adjust this, increase the iterations or decrease them. We're still seeing some of those breaking edges. Maybe if we increase the Phong angle to 60, and then we, lower the iterations. We don't want to lose too much of the detail and the separation. So yeah, I think that works. And then we'll just hold Alt and throw everything into a subdivision surface, and you can see that really smooths everything out. So we don't maybe need, yeah, I think just change this to 1 in both render and editor, and that's fine. Okay, so next we want to have sort of like as certain, I'm going to turn that subdivision off for now. As like certain bubbles inflate, I want the ground around it to sort of, like ripple based on the impact of those first few bubbles. So we're just going to throw a jiggle deformer underneath the smoothing. So we'll have smoothing first, and then we'll do the jiggle. And let's just see what this does right off the bat. Yeah, so you see right off, you can see like this rippling that's happening, and this may be too much. So we can increase the stiffness and tweak these settings a little bit. Maybe that's too much, so maybe 60 in the stiffness. Let's see. And then let's turn back on our subdivision and see how that looks. I still think that's maybe too much. We can increase the drag to something like 40. Yeah, that's looking a little better. And then maybe just take the overall strength down to like 75. Actually, I think what I did in my previous version was the jiggle and then the smoothing. So let's just see how that looks. If that, yeah, that's what I did. I think you can honestly increase the strength back a little bit, and it just smooths out that, so that there's not so many crazy wrinkles, but it still has like really nice rippling and stuff like that. So let's go ahead, and now that that's all good, let's cache that out. All right, let's take a look. And so that's calculating a little slower. It's moving 11 FPS, which isn't real time, but it's pretty good. All right, so let's hop over into Octane. First thing, before we even kick off Octane, I'm just gonna set up a camera. So I'm just gonna do a new camera, go into the camera. I want this to be a square, so let's do 1280 by 1280. And then we'll just increase the camera's view. Something I like to do is just hit Shift V, and that'll take you to the view options, the viewport options, and you can go to the view and the tinted border. I like to just increase that so that we really just see what we're looking at. So yeah, something like that. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, let's go to like this frame for the sake of this. All right, and we can kick off the Octane render. And let's just bring this in so so we can see it. The same there. So first thing I like to do, obviously, just set it to path tracing mode so that the lighting is a lot more accurate. We can adjust the samples and the GI clamp so that we don't get a bunch of fireflies in there. And then this is a workflow that I use a lot with Octane. Is you've got your viewport, which displays here, and if you middle mouse and move over to any one of these other viewports, I like to just set this to perspective mode and go into like something like this so that I can move around and adjust my lights without having to worry about the Octane viewer changing. So let's set up, just do like a targeted area light. It'll create a light target in the middle. Let's just move this somewhere. Let's see, our camera's facing that way. All right, so we're doing something super simple. So just change the size, maybe move it a little more to the side here. Looks pretty good. I'm just gonna give this a color material so that we can see it a little better. All right, yeah, maybe increase the roughness here. Okay, and then we'll throw down a Octane HDRI environment and image texture. I've got an HDRI. This one usually works pretty good. And then, we could create another light. This is super basic, just kind of, this is a very quick, basic lighting setup that I would typically do. And so we've got this light coming on from the top right, and then we can have this sort of like hair light, maybe a little more power coming from over here. Maybe move it back, just give it that nice glare right there. And then maybe we want this to be even bigger. And I don't think I'm gonna do as glossy of a material, so we won't see those as pronounced. Yeah, so something like that works fine. If you want to do any sort of texture on here, like a pattern or like a dot pattern or something like that, it should map out actually pretty well. But for our sake, let's just keep it simple. Just maybe change the roughness and then tweak the color a little bit. Do something like that. Like a deep purple is cool. Or we could do, this is just something I always just go in way too deep on textures and like colors that don't really matter that much. But yeah, I think I like rough, and then we could increase the index of refraction, give it a little more shiny, like a shiny roughness or something. What color? Maybe I liked that purple. That was pretty good. I will actually use the texture I've got to maybe project this just so we can take it a little further. Black actually looks really cool. And I mean, you can see like with the reflections and all that, like when we get these ripples, it starts to look really nice. And then they start to just like smush together. So really cool. Let's go to just this dot pattern that I have. We can scale it down. Yeah, something like that's cool. And then, so it's just black and white, so maybe we grab a gradient and wire that in there. And then the black ones we would want to be like a light purple, and the white we want to be that deep purple we were working with before. So something like that, you can kind of see if we zoom in just how that's looking. Really cool. And then, you can go into the camera tag and adjust the, add some bloom. Gotta have that bloom, gotta make it pop. That doesn't matter for this. You could do like you could reverse this gradient and make it like a light gray. Maybe we do like that. Give it more of like a paper texture or something. Increase the roughness. At this point, I'm just playing around, but yeah, you get the idea. That's pretty much the tutorial. If you want, I have these project files up on my website, so you can download them and just play around, and yeah, that's about it. All right, one more thing I forgot to mention when I was recording. So actually, if you look at this, let me hide all these scene elements here. Everything looks, it's very like, we've gotten rid of the polygon edge issues, but it's a little too smooth in some areas, you know? Like, I feel like this could use some more definition. So a quick, like, this is not a part of the simulation, or, you know, it's kind of like a cheat to do this, but if you really want to just kind of push those bubbles a little bit further, so they really look like they're just like touching like right up on the edge of each other, what I did was add a displacer underneath the jiggle and the smooth, and in the shading we just do a color, and see, it gets super like rigid. But basically what this does, if we set this to 0, if we turn this up little by little, you see it's just sort of pushing everything out on the vertex normal. So since these bubbles already have like defined vertex normals of whichever way the vertexes are pointing is sort of the way that it will push out. If you do that and almost like maybe just get it to where they're just barely overlapping, it won't really be that visible to like the eye, but when they press up against each other, they really look like they're sort of like pressed and like get really compressed. So that was just one more thing that I did in the test render that I wanted to point out. You could put this below the smoothing and increase it, and then, you know, increase the smoothing, and you can kind of just play around with that to make them look more like compressed, like they're really inflated and they're trying to like push against each other. Like I said, there's a bunch of stuff you can kind of play with it how you want, but that's just one more thing that I forgot to mention that I think is honestly adds kind of a lot just from one like simple deformer being added in this mix of the jiggle and the smooth. All right, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you want, like I said, the project files are on my website. If you just go to travisragsdale.com and go to the project files tab, there's all the project files from this tutorial and previous tutorials on there for free download. If you have ideas for future tutorials that you'd like to see, just shoot me a message on my website or through Instagram, and maybe we can make it happen. All right, thanks.